So I'm going to tell you a story that starts in the early 90s about a group of scientists that got together to solve a global health problem. Was it curing cancer? No, it wasn't. What about malnutrition? Nope. What about hypertension? It sort of was about curing hypertension. This is the story of how Viagra came to be. A group of scientists who were studying about how to decrease hypertension in the male population found that a product they were working with actually didn't have the intended effect, but it had other effects that they could, let's say, leverage. They applied for a patent in 1996. In 1998, Viagra hit the shelves. And a few weeks later, actually, it was covered by all insurance. By 2012, Viagra was 4.3 billion on the global marketplace. So great, right? Everybody's happy. Well, sure, except women who were having a hard time sometimes keeping up with their partners. So what about female Viagra, right? That seems like a reasonable answer to the solution. Well, not so much, and here's what we've figured out. The road to the little pink pill has been a little rocky. And some of the answer lies strictly in how Viagra was found in the first place. There's something called inherent bias. I'm sure all of you have heard about it. Inherent bias simply means that the rules of institutions and power reflect the interest of those who build them, right? The FDA, like many governmental structures, was built by men. And what we found is that they had not only written the rules, but that in fact, even products that were designed for both genders were disproportionately tested by men, right? So it was an accident that they found Viagra, but the fact that the product benefited men was no accident at all. You tend to find what you're looking for. So that's okay. So people said, okay, we'll get together, we'll try and figure out the little pink pill, female Viagra. So here's what we found. The FDA requires in clinical trials 1,000 for even to apply for a patent on the marketplace. Male Viagra, they went through 3,000. As I said, they went in about 2 years. Female Viagra started looking for a patent 2 years after male Viagra hit the shelves and didn't get one until 2013 after they'd gone through 11,000 clinical trials. Why is that? I've spoken to the makers of the product, and they tell me that while they did face some overt hostility at the FDA, it wasn't really that. It was that the way that the metrics were designed were not taught to look at the different ways that females process things versus males. The effects of Viagra on males are, well, shall we say, pretty apparent. For females, we're just not wired that way. There was literally no protocol at the FDA to gauge female sexual arousal. And that's not it. We hit another bump in the road. Female Viagra has side effects: dizziness, drowsiness, nausea, unconsciousness when mixed with alcohol. Oh, but wait. Male Viagra also has dizziness, drowsiness, nausea. You guys have all heard the commercials, right? Fine to take except for blah, 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 blah. Anyway, but the risks of female Viagra actually held it up, and the risks of male Viagra did not. My friend Sally Greenberg at Consumer Union League says women, just like men, should be allowed to manage their own health risks, right? That was the inherent bias at the FDA. Men could think about risk and make their own decisions, women could not. So, what does this little story tell us? Inherent bias is everywhere. It's not just at the FDA, and it's actually not just about gender, which we know, even though that is the disproportionate focus of this talk. The pay gap, which should look very familiar to you, combines race and gender and lets you know, I'm sure this is all really familiar, so I'm only going to spend a minute on it. White women make 81 cents on the dollar, black women make 65 cents on the dollar, Hispanic women 57 cents on the dollar, right? Women make less than men. This is obvious. The question is not what, but why? Why are women making less than men? Women are making less than men because inherent bias, women generally stay home with the kids and men go out and earn money, combined with overt bias, in some sectors. Women should stay home with the kids while men should go out and earn money. And those are very powerful social factors to overcome when you have those layered on top of each other. So despite the fact that we know this, we haven't been able to overcome it. And it's not just the what and the why, but it's the impact of that. Women are significant breadwinners in families. 2 out of 3 women with children work. 3 out of 4 women work. 2 out of 3 women with children are actually the primary breadwinners in their family. So you can't just look at that pay gap and think, oh, wow, that sucks. Women don't make as much as men. There's actually a compounding effect to it. Women are asked to stretch a dollar further, not just for themselves, but for the families that are dependent on them. And the impact that we get is policy that doesn't reflect our real lives, the real needs of families around us. This should be obvious to you guys too. But when we talk about why this stuff doesn't change, this is just federal government. We could do it at state and local level. Women make up a lot less elected leadership than men, right? We all know this. What you may or may not know is that this percentage puts us at 57th in the world. We're on par with Turkmenistan, just in case you want to feel proud about that. Why is this? Women do win when they run for office. They're just less than half as likely to run. They don't have the same amount of role models. They're busier than men. They've been taught to stay the same course, right? Take less risks. And even when they sort of pursue the idea of running, they get less support. They get less financial support. They get less emotional support. They get less encouragement. So this is what we end up with. And the problem with that is elected leadership that could solve some of the problems we were just talking about tends to vote what they know best. And they tend to vote their own interests because, after all, I spent a lot of time in DC, you guys. Politicians are just like all of us. We all tend to focus on our own interests, right? So this is a perfect example of inherent bias. This is a credit card ad from 1993 that says, Marine Midland has a credit card so safe, even your wife won't be able to use it, right? What does this tell you? This tells you men go out and work really, really hard to earn money, and women cannot be trusted with it because we're frivolous and trivial. This despite women then, as now, were ultimately familiar with what it meant to plan a monthly budget, make the groceries stretch over the course of a month. And in fact, women make up 70% of purchasing power in this country. This inherent bias was so deep and so intense. How many of you know that women could not get a credit card without their husband's permission until 1974? I see a lot of people with their hands up. That's good. You guys are way ahead of the curve. Usually people don't know that. All right, so what does this all mean? You guys asked me to talk about a renegade idea. I read on your website that that meant an idea that goes against convention, that goes against the grain, that questions some of the things we think to be true. What if the key to actual progress and prosperity is to turn that implicit bias on its head and think through a women-centric lens, right? AKA, what I say, what if what's good for the goose really, really is what's good for the gander? Because one of the things that we have to expand our thinking about is it would be enough to fight for gender equality just because women are human and women have human rights. It would be enough. But what if we're not just holding back individual women? What if we're not just holding back millions of women? What if we're actually holding back all of society, our entire country, because we can't overcome our internal bias? Let me tell you a story about winter 2013. This is Washington, D.C. It was Snowmageddon. The entire city was shut down. I live about 5 blocks from there. Nobody was on the streets unless you were on cross-country skis or having a snowball fight, and nobody could get to work. Or could they? This is a picture of 20 women senators who managed to make it to work when not a single one of their male colleagues could. It's not just the women senators, but you can see in the picture that there's women pages, there's women secretaries, and there is one dude there who I think was snowed in because he was the overnight security guard, I'm told. So what happened in these 3 days that they were the only ones who showed up? They actually moved more legislation forward than the entire Senate had moved in the previous 2 months. Now, this is not because women are perfect and men suck. It really isn't. It really isn't. It's just that we have different ways of operating. And women tend to work from a starting place of where is our common interest, and let's hold progress in mind. It doesn't mean that we agree on everything. It really doesn't. But it does mean that we are naturally inclined towards collaboration that can work towards everyone's best interest because we've been doing it for a really long time. And in fact, the same group of women during the government shutdown much later that year, in October of that year, met for weeks behind the scenes and crafted a plan that they could give to Harry Reid on the Democratic side and Mitch McConnell on the Republican side that actually broke the government shutdown. And they let the guys take the credit, but they were the ones who wrote the plan. So that's the government sector. Private sector is actually worse. Representation of women in the private sector is actually worse. This is a pretty complicated quote that talks about the return on equity for companies with women in more than 10% of key leadership positions is 27% better than those with less than 5%. What does this mean? More women, more money. That's really what it means. Companies with women and more women in leadership positions have better return on the investment. But that's not it. Companies with women in key leadership positions also have better policies on corporate social responsibility, which means they're not just thinking about the bottom line, they're not just thinking about the short term, they're thinking about environmental output, working conditions, human rights. And Christine Lagarde, who is the head of the International Monetary Fund, came out with a study last year that actually showed if we could get better representation in women in the United States workforce, that our GDP could grow by 5%. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but when you look at America's GDP, that translates into $901 billion a year. For India, if we could get more women in the workplace there, their GDP could grow by 27%. This is what I call the women effect. The women effect is when you decide that you're going to invest in women, and the ROI is not just good for women. It's good for our families, it's good for society, it's good for our country, and it's good for our world. That's the women effect. So you might ask, what is the head of a reproductive rights organization standing up here 8 minutes into her speech? She hasn't even mentioned anything about reproductive rights. Oh my goodness. It's because we can't have an honest conversation about how women get engaged civically, business-wise, any other way, unless we start by acknowledging that our ability to control our own fertility and our own reproduction controls everything else about our lives. There is no way to solve for women's participation, for their economic security, without centralizing the idea of reproductive rights and reproductive freedom. Melinda Gates knows this. Some of you may have seen her recent essay in Forbes where she talked about the Gates Foundation upping their investment in philanthropy by hundreds of millions of dollars globally in contraception. She's traveled all over the world. She's seen the fact that contraception and family planning is the single most determinative factor in whether young girls finish school, go on to get jobs, stay out of abusive relationships, and lead productive lives. She, in fact, says that contraception is the first and foremost key to unlock potential of girls and women. And it's not just contraception, right? Unintended pregnancy happens. It's abortion too. One of the things that we know through a long-term study called the Turnaway Study that measured women, somebody knows it back there. I'm gonna tell my friends who did it. The Turnaway Study was completely transformational in the way that we think about abortion access and abortion services, because they were able to control study and measure one group of women who were able to access abortion, controlling for all socioeconomic factors, against another group of women that were denied abortion when they asked for it. And what they found is that the women that were denied abortion were more likely to continue living in poverty, were less likely to finish education, were more likely to stay with abusive partners, and 6 in 10 of them were already mothers, and they were less likely to be able to take care of the families that they already had. This is because we are not allowing women to have control over their own decisions and their own lives. Sometimes when we think about reproductive rights, we only think about contraception and abortion. At NARAL, we work on the other side of the equation because lots of people, like myself, end up wanting to become parents, right? We don't treat women as parents very good in this country either. We make it really, really difficult. I don't know if you guys remember, but in 2013, there was a Supreme Court case called Peggy Young versus UPS. This was a young woman who was pregnant with a very wanted pregnancy, who was told by her doctor she had to stop lifting all these really heavy boxes that UPS required her to lift or she might risk losing the baby. And UPS fired her. They said, you can't do your job. We're going to fire you. That's how we treat women who want children in this country. We rank dead last in the industrialized world in offering parental leave to new parents, moms and dads, by the way. And the studies show that kids benefit when both have it, equal opportunity, and that kids from families who do not have the ability to take any time off are much more likely to live in poverty, much more likely to have health problems. So you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't when it comes to reproductive rights right now. And some of that is inherent bias, and some of it is overt bias. There are people who really, really want it to stay that way, right? And that's what we've been, this is what they call the virtuous circle. I forgot I had this slide. Which says that the virtuous circle is when we actually give women everything they need to avoid unintended pregnancies, plan their pregnancies, allow them to terminate unwanted pregnancies, and then support them as they're becoming mothers. Everybody advances. Their children are healthier, they're healthier, they're more economically secure, and they can participate more in society. This is a chart of the last many, many years, and it shows you how many abortion restrictions have been introduced at the state level. You can see that they've been going along for a while, and they kind of took off in 2010. I don't know if you guys remember what happened in 2010, but Obama had been elected. There were a lot of people in this country that didn't like it. It was the rise of the Tea Party. The Tea Party in and of itself actually was about small government and tax reform at the beginning, and then it converged with some pretty unsavory characters in terms of nationalists and in terms of the anti-choice, the very, very organized anti-choice movement. And I always say anti-choice because there are individual people who have personal beliefs. That's great. We love diversity of beliefs, right? The problem is when you have an organized movement saying, this is my belief, so I get to tell you and you what to do, right? And that's what we're seeing here, being very, very, very effective. This is the organized anti-choice movement, and this is the amount of abortion restrictions that they've been able to actually enact in the last 5 years. Some of this play on inherent bias, right? Many of you have seen things about waiting periods or invasive ultrasounds that are unnecessary, right? That's basically this inherent bias that women can't make up their own minds unless the government tells them to take time out and think real carefully about what they're doing, as though women actually don't think really, really carefully before making these decisions. Some of them are totally overt bias, and we're seeing that more and more since this last election. In fact, in the last couple of weeks in Oklahoma and Arkansas, there have just been bills put out there that's basically like, a man can sue you as a doctor if you perform an abortion on his partner, or he can seek an injunction and stop you as a woman from having an abortion, which is not about partnership at all, right? That's actually about control, which is really what we're talking about when it comes to the overt bias. But here's the interesting thing about the people who pursue the overt bias. I always say this, they're not really anti-abortion, because if they were, they would join hands with us and fight for access to contraception and fight for the kinds of policies that support working moms. They don't do any of that. In fact, many of these people fought the ACA tooth and nail, which offered universal access to contraception, right? The other thing the ACA did that they tried to take down, I think it was collateral damage, but they didn't pay attention to, was that prior to the ACA, survivors of domestic violence, that was considered a pre-existing condition. Your insurance company could drop you as a survivor of domestic violence. These are really significant advances that have been fought by these people, right? So this is what we're up against if we want to achieve the women effect. It is really, really important to make sure that people are aware of this dynamic if we're ever to unlock the full potential of women participating in society. And how do we do that? It's pretty simple. We organize, we speak out, we become renegades, we call out internal bias when we see it. And we definitely question our own things. We call out external bias when we see it, and we definitely question our own internal bias, right? One of the things that's very personal to me that I say all the time is what's allowed these laws to continue to persevere is a deep, deep, deep internal bias that there are two kinds of girls in the world. There are good girls who have families, and there are bad girls who have abortions. The reality is we are the same women at different points in our lives making the best decisions for us. So whether you're a goose, whether you're a gander, you can all join in the fight, and when we do, we will see the return on investment of the women effect. Thank you very much.